Hello and welcome back to the channel. A museum is just a building that holds things. It might be historical artifacts, scientific instruments, documents, art, cultural icons. In fact, it could be almost anything that someone at least thinks needs to be remembered. But sometimes the museum building itself is something that needs to be remembered because it tells us about how the people who lived in the area thought about things. Some people like museums, other people dread and avoid them at all costs. There's no arguing about taste. If you want to visit a museum, you can do a bit of research in advance to see how to best allocate your time and your sightseeing dollars. Museums in Europe can be quite expensive, so it's best to go prepared. Today we're going to visit a museum that counts as a twofer. It not only contains artifacts, Impressionist art, but the building itself is an artifact. Today it's the Musée d'Orsay, here on the Armchair Traveler. My name is Judy, and I love travel, history, and finding out what makes people tick. If you're enjoying my content, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your help means more people will see my content. If you want more information, I have a WordPress blog, a page on Facebook, and a Twitter handle. The addresses are here or in the information block at the bottom of the screen. Thank you and enjoy your visit. Napoleon had a vision for the transformation of Paris. He knew his new government would need space to house not just the legislators, but all of the bureaucrats he required to make things actually work. The Palais d'Orsay was just such a building. The name Palais might mislead you into thinking it was some royal palace, but like the word chateau, which we usually associate with a kind of royal palace and only secondarily, if at all, as a military structure, the word palais means more than just a palace. It means a large and generally extravagantly decorated space. Napoleon's engineers picked a site along the Quai d'Orsay, one of the many wharfs or embankments along the river. Napoleon was defeated and forced into exile in 1815, so he was no longer there to push things along. Wars, lack of funding, and construction problems delayed completion of the building until 1840. The quay gets its name from an 18th century French bureaucrat named Charles Boucher, who was the Lord of Orsay and administrator of commerce for the city of Paris between 1700 and 1708. Americans learn in their history that on some level, when we were in a desperate struggle to break away from England, the French, who in those days were the mortal enemies of the English, came to our aid. They didn't contribute a lot, and they absolutely didn't help out because they thought our notions of liberty and equality were wonderful ideas, although later on they eventually adopted them into their motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité. They saw the American issue as putting an additional thorn in the side of the English, and that was good enough for us. America managed to split from the English, but there was no certainty that we could keep that separation intact. Meanwhile, the French government was in a state of dizzying disarray. Later on, in 1870, a rising Prussia, helmed by an aggressive Prussian diplomat named Otto von Bismarck, decided to make his mark in the world. One of his great goals was to unify the German states under his, and therefore Prussian, leadership. In the end, the Prussians actually managed to provoke the French into declaring a war. It was a very bad move. Cutting to the chase, the French lost. Napoleon III, who was then in charge, was defeated and actually captured at the Battle of Sedan. His so-called Second Empire collapsed and was replaced, at least in Paris, by something called the Commune. The Commune only lasted for 3 months or so, but it was a nightmare of fighting and instability. Government offices were moved out of the Palais d'Orsay to Versailles, where they thought they would be safer. Toward the end of the Commune, a mob inspired by them set fire to the Palais, along with other notable buildings like the Hôtel de Ville and the Tuileries Palace. This image shows you what the burnt-out Palais d'Orsay looked like before it was revived as a train station. 3 decades or so after the Commune burnt the Palais to the ground, the company that owned the Paris-Orléans train line decided it needed a mid-city terminus and settled on this abandoned site to build its station. The station originally went by the name Gare d'Orléans because it was the endpoint of the Orléans train line. Although the station site had been abandoned, there was a great deal of architecture in the general neighborhood, especially across the river and including the Louvre and the Hôtel de Ville. The Parisians weren't about to put in something that would stick out like a sore thumb. The company hired a team of architects headed by Victor Laloux. And the Beaux-Arts style of his design bears considerable similarity to the Gare de Tours and the Hôtel de Ville de Tours. The building might have looked old-timey on the outside, but it was packed with modern innovations of the day, including electric lines and passenger elevators, as well as a 370-room hotel in the western end of the station. Including the hotel in or adjacent to a subway terminus was quite common in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Occasionally, some kind of general disaster occurs that is so bad that people still talk about it a century later. All over Paris, you'll actually find site markers showing high water levels from the 1910 Great Flood. The Seine River seriously overflowed in late 1909 and early 1910. Thousands of Parisians were evacuated from their homes, and the basic infrastructure had to shut down because of the rising water. Remarkably, despite the damage and the duration of the flood, nobody drowned, for which everyone was properly grateful. The damage, however, to infrastructure was enormous, and I think probably was one of the markers of the beginning of the end of this station. The Gare d'Orsay building was outmoded and eventually abandoned, but it had a great location and look, as you can see in this photo, which I took from across the Seine. What finished it off eventually was the fact that trains were getting longer, with more cars. Longer cars wouldn't fit in that station, and the way the station is oriented, it could not be extended. By the late 1930s, the SNCF, that's the National Train Company, had to stop running long-distance trains on the line. The station continued to service suburban trains for some years afterwards, but in 1973, even the hotel shut down. The station was mostly abandoned after that. In the 1960s, however, the French public had developed an appetite for redeveloping empty or underused infrastructure with something not just functional, but possibly modern. This was the age of tear it down and start over. The historic Les Halles Market, for example, badly needed a makeover. I remember it from my first visit in 1970. Instead of fixing it up, they tore it down and replaced it with a concrete mall with little charm. Plans were drawn up to actually demolish the Gare d'Orsay and replace it with a new building, and proposals included an airport, a government ministry building, and a school of architecture. Permission was finally granted to construct a hotel on the site, but in 1971, Jacques Duhamel, who was then the Minister of Culture under President Georges Pompidou, said no. The station building was in what the French call a sensitive location on the Seine, facing the Tuileries Garden and the Louvre, and it was feared that a modern building, something like the FBI building in Washington, D.C. comes to mind, would not fit in well with the surrounding architecture. In 1973, the Gare d'Orsay was designated a protected historical monument. If that sounds familiar, it should. This was the 20th century version of the reason the building was designed in the Beaux-Arts style initially. By 1977, the Pompidou Center, which is either awful or wonderful, and of all the people I've ever talked to about it, no one seems to be indifferent, had opened up to deal with modern art. The Louvre remained overstuffed, and having dealt with the more modern pieces, began casting around for an appropriate venue for its vast collection of Impressionist-era art, including the likes of Manet and Monet, although the latter's enormous water lilies remain at the Musée d'Orangerie, Van Gogh and Gauguin, and some more modern art, including Matisse, Modigliani, and Picasso, although the latter's collection in the museum of its own name, a mere 3 miles away, is generally better. The museum opened up in 1986 and is now the second most visited in France after the Louvre. Working in a vast empty space, the planners were also able to make the site handicapped accessible, with ramps on either side of the central hallway, useful not just for people in wheelchairs, but for anyone with bad knees, including your favorite armchair traveler. Accurate clocks are always an important feature at any transportation venue, and the Gare d'Orsay was no exception. This is one of those clocks seen from the inside. That conical feature you see in the far distance in about the center of the frame is Sacré-Cœur. It was an extremely clear day when I took this photograph. The immense Ferris wheel that you can see toward the right of the image goes up every summer across the river in the Tuileries. Auguste Bartholdi didn't just start soldering Miss Liberty together. He made models, and this is one of them. Notice above Liberty's torch the skylights and the coffered ceiling. This was originally the train shed, and the glass would have let in much-needed sunlight, at least during daylight hours. We might think political lampooning is new, but the French have been at this almost since before America was a country. When I visited the museum, they were doing a retrospective of the art of Honoré Daumier. Daumier was doing political cartoons as early as the 1830s. The image on the left may look like a caricature of Ronald Reagan. That's what I actually thought it was when I first saw it, but it's actually a man named Jean Valdrome. The image on the right is of Jacques Lefebvre. He was a banker, apparently, and possibly Jewish, which would account for the elongated nose, but my husband said it reminded him more of Broadway and Hollywood actor Brent Spiner. Two of the most popular exhibits in the museum are actually models. On the left, you can see a small section of the model of Paris, shown from above, and kept under glass that you can walk on. I really did not enjoy walking on that glass, so I only took a photograph of a small section of the model. The dome building in the center is the Opera Garnier, the main opera house here in the city. On the right is a second model showing a cutaway of that same opera house. One of the museum's most iconic works, this polar bear, the standout work of one Francois Pompon. While he was at one point an assistant of Camille Claudel and Auguste Rodin, he eventually struck out on his own and is best known for his animal-inspired works. He exhibited this work, there are copies all over, in 1927. Camille Claudel was a somewhat unstable but brilliant and interesting woman. She was the lover and muse of Auguste Rodin. This piece, called The Old Wall, shows a man carried away by an old woman, symbolizing time. The sign says it's autobiographical. The pleading woman you see in the background is said to be Claudel herself, on being abandoned by Rodin, who profited immensely from her artistry. Claudel was badly mistreated, not just by Rodin, but by much of her family, which eventually had her locked up in an insane asylum. She had accused Rodin of stealing her ideas, which was probably true, but unwise because he was important and she was just a woman. She became so distraught that she began destroying her own work. She died in 1943, having never regained her freedom. But now it's time for us to move on to lunch or possibly dinner. The museum offers a variety of venues. Let's take a look. I'm generally a fan of museum restaurants, although it pays to check out the menu in advance and pay attention to the prices. When this venue was a train station, it included a 370-room hotel which had its own quite fancy Beaux-Arts-style restaurant. Remnants of once had been the formal restaurant in the Hotel Orsay are still here. It's beautiful and comes complete with frescoes, gilt ceilings, chandeliers, and a wall of windows that actually looks out over the Seine River. It's a historic French monument in its own right. I haven't been inside. I was too cheap, but I have seen photographs, and if you're looking for an elegant experience in exquisite surroundings, this just might be the place. I think if I were dining there, I'd choose the prix fixe menu, however. It's 33 euros for either a starter and a main, or a main and a dessert. Add on another 10 euros or so if you want wine. Thank you for joining me today for this visit to the Musée d'Orsay. Come back next time for another adventure with me here on The Armchair Traveler.